Welcome to week 2 in our series on generations. I attempted to record our class session last night, but for some reason, the video only recorded the first 12 minutes, which disappointed me greatly. But because I recorded week 1, and because my intent is to provide a recording of each week for people who are serving in Kid Connection, for people who are unable to attend, I wanted to make sure I had something up for week 2. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of review the content that was presented last night. That way, at least you're up to speed. I'm obviously not going to be able to recreate the conversations that we had. I might try to remember some of the comments that were made, so you get a little feel of where some of the conversation went. But hopefully, in a short period of time, this will give you at least an idea of where we went last week and an idea of what's going on with Generation Alpha. So I hope you find this helpful. At the table, when we began class, I had them discuss 2 questions. Which generation do you spend the most time with? And which generation do you wish you spent the most time with? And the answers were interesting, and I really wanted to hear an answer to the second question. And the answers were varied. Some people wanted to spend time with Alpha because their grandkids were Alpha. Some people wanted to spend time with the silent generation because they're older and they have so much life experience and so much wisdom they want to draw from. Noah Ford, a millennial, said that he wanted to spend more time with millennials because they're the greatest generation, so we had some fun with him as well. So lots of different answers in terms of who they wish they spent more time with. Then I reviewed our class. The goal of this class is to give understanding. It's to help us understand one another with the primary goal of walking with one another towards Jesus, as our church is committed to My Circle, and we're praying for those who do not know Jesus. We want to engage them and share Christ with them. You know, some of these generational or life phase differences can influence how we interact with different people. Hopefully, as believers, it can help us understand one another to help us be more united, just to give us a better understanding of who we're worshiping with. So the procedure that we're going to go through is to talk about a generation and then to talk about their current life phase. So week 2 is trying to understand Alpha. And I again gave the disclaimer that we don't have a lot of data on Alpha. The oldest Alpha is 13 years old, so we simply don't know who they are or who they're going to be or what they're going to encounter in life. So this is a challenging week, I think. Next week, we're going to talk about children because the oldest Alpha is 13 years old. So they are infants to preteens, to young teenagers. And so next week, we're going to spend time talking about walking with children towards Jesus. Now, here's where the topic really explodes. There's so much material to talk about emotionally, socially, cognitively, and how do all of those things come into play as we want to journey with them towards Jesus. It's going to be a lot of material. I think the challenge is going to be presenting a lot of material, giving people an opportunity to talk. It's just not an hour. It's just not a lot of time to do that. So it's a challenge, but I'm hoping it raises a lot of interesting points and leads to some good conversations. So as a review, here are the 6 generations that are alive today. Again, the names of the generations might be debated a little bit, and even the dates of the generations might be debated a little bit. If you read different sociologists, they might give or take a few years. But if you're studying generations, at some point you have to have boundaries. And so these are the boundaries that Jean Twenge in her book Generations provides. Couple of comments on this setup. So I'm using Jean Twenge's book Generations, and I said, like I said in week 1, I'm using her book as a great description of what is going on. I've read a few books by Jean Twenge. I think she's a great sociologist. I think she's a master of the data and a master of analyzing the data. And for that reason, I really, really love her work. But I view sociology as descriptive. It's telling us what's going on. I do not view it as prescriptive, telling us what should be going on. That, I think, is reserved for God and His Word. It's God who tells us the way things should be. So I like this balance. We can take a great sociologist, Jean Twenge, and learn how things are. And then we could look at the Word of God to see how things should be. So that's an important distinction. The other thing that I mentioned last night was that we're always speaking in generalities, right? These trends are often true and they might characterize the majority of the generation, but there are always exceptions. And so when we're in ministry, it's important to remember the person that's immediately in front of us. It's helpful to have this big picture knowledge of a generation. But who is the person in front of us? They might be different from their generation in one way or another. And our responsibility at that moment is not to minister to a whole generation. We can't do that, but to minister to that person. So I asked Ainsley and Olivia to tell us something about how iGen sees their generation, but how they are different. And so Olivia mentioned that sometimes iGens are considered lazy. And she says, we're not all lazy. I'm hardworking. I just graduated. I have a job and I'm working to go to PA school. And so she says, we're not all lazy. Ainsley said, sometimes we're viewed as everybody has a victim mentality. And our generation, we're all victims over something. But she says, I've been taught to take responsibility. I don't see myself as a victim of everything. So I thought those were good insights about how there are maybe general characteristics, and maybe they're generally true, but not every individual within that generation fits those characteristics. Again, in ministry, we need to know the person in front of us and how to reach them for Christ. I did want to review Twangy's model. She has a technological model of generational differences. So she says it's not just major events that happen in the world that impact a generation. She says it's primarily technology. And so last week we talked about how technology changes the way we live, changes the way we relate, and changes the way we think. And so we use the washing machine as an example. It's no longer a community event down at a river, but I can throw clothes in my washing machine, walk away for an hour and a half, have my phone tell me when it's done, and then go back to it. I never have to leave my house. I never have to do anything like that. It's an individual process, and it has freed up a lot of time. So technology leads to generations. And I did mention that technology impacts every generation, but it impacts them differently. So I picked on Vic Ide because the cell phone has certainly impacted Vic Ide's life, but not in the way that a cell phone impacts a 10-year-old. Because Vic has a manner of living, a manner of thinking, a manner of relating that does not include cell phones, because that's the way he was for the majority of his life. If you're in Generation Alpha, all you know is cell phones and internet connectivity. So it changes the way we relate and it changes the way we think. Technology also leads to increasing individualism. The automobile, the washing machine, the phone, all of these things are examples of how the technology can lead us to be more individualistic. And we live a slower life pace. Now, what I mean by that is not day to day. Everybody's busy from day to day. But the life pace, or what she calls a life strategy, is the time that it takes to reach certain events. When do you get a driver's license? When do you get married? When do you have kids? When do you begin a career that will last you 10 plus years? All of those things are slower now. We are achieving them later. That's not saying that's good or bad. It's just observation. I gave one classic example of how all of this comes together last night, and it's the birth control pill. Think about the medical technology of the birth control pill, which was in the 1960s, I think. That technology allowed females to have a greater say and a greater determination in when they will become moms. They didn't even have to ask anybody about it, right? They could just do that on their own. And so that changed how they could live their lives. Around the same time, female attendance in colleges shot up dramatically. So notice how the birth control pill can lead to increasing individualism. Now I can decide. Now I have control. Now I can delay for whatever reason I want to delay. Notice how that leads to a slower life strategy. Now I can go to college. I can delay having a family. And so the birth control pill, I think, is a good example of how a medical technology advancement can impact the way we live, the way we relate. It can help us become more individualistic. It can slow our life strategy down. Randy Redmer mentioned something that I thought was good. And he says, hey, I like this model, but there's so many things that influence a generation. So many different ways that influence how we think, how we live, what we believe. And I agree totally. I mentioned a book by Margaret Wheatley called Leadership and the New Science. And it's a book I didn't fully understand because she's too smart and she talks about quantum physics. But here's the big idea of her book. We used to think that every cause had a single effect. So when something happens in our lives, we want to look back for what's the single thing that caused this? And she said, look, if we understand quantum physics, which I do not, if we understand quantum physics, we have to realize that it's rarely, if ever, a single cause leading to a single effect. Rather, it is all kinds of different causes leading to all kinds of different effects. And sometimes we don't even understand causes that happen down the chain 3 steps ago, but they still influence it. The point is, Randy's right. There's not a single cause that leads to a single effect. It's a multitude of causes, some of which we understand, some of which we don't. Now, I think the class agree that this model is very good. But no, it's not totally comprehensive, and that's okay. I had them stop and talk at their tables because every generation is impacted by individualism. America, we are a classically individualistic culture. We began that way, we remain that way, and we're just getting more and more individualistic. So I had them talk, what does the Bible say about that? Pro or con, what does the Bible say about individualism? And how might we minister in an increasingly individualistic world? And so some people said, the Bible is totally against individualism. It's about loving God with our whole heart. It's about loving our neighbor as ourselves. It's about sacrificing. It's about servanthood. It's about community. Other people said, well, there are aspects of individualism. We are not a part of the people of God because of our biology or because of our family, but we have to make a decision to follow Jesus. And so there was some discussion about how the Bible is largely others-centered and more community-centered, but there may be still aspects where we as individuals are responsible for our faith. And so that was an interesting discussion because, again, we want to talk about this general trend. I think we can all admit that every generation is individualistic. And that goes against the way the Bible speaks a lot. So how does it impact our ministry? We talked about how individualism can lead to loneliness. Because the more we pull into our garages and shut the garage door and don't see anybody, and we're sitting on our phones and we never have to leave our homes, we can become more lonely. So one of the things that the church can do is provide community. Different settings where we are engaged with others, face to face with others. A couple people mentioned the need to be in a place with others and admit that we need one another because we're hesitant to admit that. We had some questions like, well, what role then do phones? If phones lead to more individualism and more loneliness, what role do those have in our ministries? So it's just a lot of different conversations about how individualism impacts our ministry and what we can do about it maybe. Again, we're not landing on any conclusions. These are really, really big questions. But if we can start the conversation and start thinking, I think that's a good thing. So let's talk alpha. Gene Twenge has a proposal to call alpha polars. I like Gene Twenge's because she does a good job of trying to find a descriptive name for generations. So Generation X was X because we were kind of an enigma. We were weird and didn't have any great things to describe us. But then I think sociologists got lazy. We went X, Y, Z, now we're alpha. Well, that tells you absolutely nothing about them. So she goes from X to millennials to iGen. And I love iGen because that little I at the beginning of Gen has 2 meanings. It means individual, but it also refers to the iPhone and all of the i technology that's out there. And she says iGen is a technological individualistic generation. I think that's brilliant. Polars, she says, because they are being born into a time of great political polarization. And also, one of the major events taking place is a changing environment, the melting of the polar ice caps. And she says these things might impact them tremendously. So she calls them polars. Don't know if it'll catch on, but alpha and polars. I had the class talk about what they think are some of the main characteristics of alpha and alpha's future. So maybe it'd be good for you to pause the video and think for a few minutes. What do you think are the main characteristics of alpha? What do you think the future will hold for them? I remember asking Jim Normandin, because he mentioned he wanted to spend more time with alpha because of his grandkids. And I said, what do you notice about this generation that's different from you or your kids? And he said, they don't greatly desire to go outside. They're content to stay inside on technology. Great insight. So then I lectured for a little while, about 10 minutes. I lectured on the characteristics of alpha. So here we go. Here are some of the most popular names in alpha today. Jean Twenge lists several members of the alpha generation. I did not know most of them. I'm not familiar with them. But she said Alexis Ohanian, I think that's pronounced correctly, is a stereotypical alpha. Why? She's biracial. She is the daughter of Alexis Ohanian, who is one of the founders of Reddit, and Serena Williams. And at the age of 8, she's already deeply involved in technology like Instagram. Now, she has over 600,000 followers. Now, most of our kids are not going to be born to the best tennis player in history and the founder of Reddit, so probably won't have 600,000 followers. But the diversity in her family, the technology in her family, it's a small snapshot of an 8-year-old today that might be different from previous generations. Technology is the big thing. 20% by age 8 have their own smartphone. 50% by age 11 have their own smartphone. Heather mentioned, as she teaches first grade, she mentioned that this doesn't include tablets and things like watches. She says more and more kids in first grade are having smart watches because their families can keep track of them, but it also provides a level of connectivity. So in 2021, the average 8 to 12-year-old spent almost 6 hours a day on a screen. Twenge wonders what the impact will be. And so one of the quotes from her book, she says, if polars continue the Gen Z, iGen trend of being engulfed in the social media maelstrom at young ages, they may also continue the trend toward more depression and self-harm among tweens and teens. She's wondering that because she sees the data. And she sees the data about how harmful social media is, especially amongst girls. It's a very ethnically diverse. Census is going to say this will be the first generation with a non-white majority in America. So this is what alpha polar generation looks like right now. And this is what it looks like compared 100 years ago, the beginning of the silent generation, or not the beginning of the silent generation, the way the silent generation demographics ended up being. Again, not a statement of value, not saying good or bad, just saying what it is. And it's different. The makeup of our nation is changing, and that will have implications for relationships, maybe for politics, for different things like that. Safety. Alpha generation is less likely to die due to injury and less likely to go to an emergency room. I think we can all agree this is a good thing. I try to replicate some of her data. So this is the fatal injury rate in the United States per 100,000. And so you see there's a line for 0 to 4-year-olds and 5 to 9-year-olds. And since 1981, you can see how it's consistently going down. You can also see the rate of non-fatal ER visits per 100. This is just the last 25 years, but you can see how it's going down for children. Now, the question is why? Some causes are positive, probably, and some are probably negative. Again, that's a value judgment that some may disagree with, but why are they going down? Laws, regulations, awareness. So our daycares, our churches, our schools have an increased awareness of safety, medicine bottle caps that you can't get off, car seats, safety helmets, all of these laws and different things. A society is increasingly aware of making us more safe. But it might also be because they're less likely to play outside. And because of that, alpha is more likely to be overweight. So here's a graph just in the last 15 years of percent of U.S. children physically active less than 4 days a week. And you can see how these numbers are increasing. They're getting less active. So according to this chart, almost 30%, or probably over 30% now, 30% of U.S. children are active less than 4 days a week. And you can see there's a little bit of a corresponding trend of obesity. This is probably a generation that is economically well-to-do. Why? Their parents are having fewer children, so they have more money to spend on those children, and those children are probably being born to older parents who are more established in their careers. So they might be a very well-off economically. Mental health. There's some evidence that mental health went increasingly negative for this generation during COVID, but Twenge thinks maybe they're bouncing back. So you can kind of see 5 to 7 year olds experiencing anxiety or depression each month. It spiked a little bit during 2020, early 2021, but has come back down to pre-COVID levels. Still, over 15% feeling anxious and 5% feeling depressed monthly. So that's not good. But we don't know that there is an ongoing increase or a continued COVID spike. So the way Twenge writes her book, she begins with the silent generation and goes to alpha. I'm going backwards. But this is kind of her maybe potential conclusion. This book began with the story of the silent generation, another low birth rate generation born in times of calamity, the Depression and World War II. Silence went on to stable and prosperous lives, building families, making great progress in the civil rights and women's movements. Perhaps, she says, maybe growing up in a time of turmoil will make the polars stronger and ready to lead the country into better times ahead. Speculation, we don't know. Concluded with, Jean Twenge has decided to conclude this book with some predictions for the future. So based upon trends, based upon what we know of alpha now, where is this generation going and what does the future look like? These are her predictions. They're educated predictions, but it's speculation. So let me just tell you what she said around a variety of topics. Work. These generations demand work to be purposeful. They want work to have meaning. They want to see how it's helping people. There's the increased ability to do remote work and do it from home. There's an increased level of work-life blurring, or what we used to call work-life balance, where even in interviews, you're asking for time off and if you can do things like this. They are going to increasingly want safe spaces, and they're increasingly concerned about speech, because one of the things, all of life is political for them. The speech, pro or con against a politician, pro or con against an issue, it's all political, and they see that as potentially harmful or dangerous at work. So they need to be careful with speech. And work is a flatter structure. It's interesting. I asked Ralph and Vic, did you ever call your boss by their first name? And they both said, no. Vic said, well, maybe one level up, but no way more than that. And so one of the millennials said, well, what do you call him then? Do you call him Mr. Vice President? And some people in the room kind of said, yeah, that's what you call him. But this idea that it's a flatter structure, it's more personal, and we're on a first name basis with everybody. Well, what about family? She predicts fewer children, therefore fewer siblings. Now, project that out to when alpha is 80 years old. They don't have as many people taking care of them. They don't have as many siblings. That could lead to loneliness. They have older parents, and again, increased loneliness is her prediction. Now, what about politics? Jean Twenge believes it'll become more and more polarized. just more and more division. She sees changing definitions. And so she points out a few things in her book, like conservatism today is not the same as 1980s Reagan conservatism. They view government spending and regulation differently. And the same thing could be true about the liberal movement. She thinks these two movements are based more on gender than age. And again, this is her speculation. So she thinks the modern Republican conservative movement is more male-oriented, whereas the more democratic liberal movement is more female-oriented. So it's different. We used to talk about those things are age, where you're younger when you're liberal and you're liberal when you're younger and more conservative when you're older. She thinks it's going to be more of a gender split. And she thinks everybody's moving towards more regulation, technological regulation, speech regulation. What are you allowed to say and not allowed to say? Regulation for children and safety and things like that. And then what about religion? Jean Twenge says they're going to be increasingly disconnected from formal religion. Their practice of faith is going to become more individualized. And she said that the millennials changed a big trend that everybody used to believe in. Everybody used to believe that people step away from church as they go to college or work in their late teens or early 20s, but they return to church when they have kids. Twenge says the millennials bucked that trend. They have not come back as much. So she says these future generations, they're not coming back either. That changes the way we think about things. So we ended our class talking about some of the implications. Somebody mentioned, Heather mentioned, I thought this was good. If we're going to minister to Alpha, we have to minister to their caregivers as well. Our ministries really do need to be holistic in that they reach everybody. So it needs to reach their grandparents, because sometimes grandparents are taking care of kids. It needs to reach their moms and dads. Maybe it even needs to reach out and reach their teachers to love and encourage them. And there were some conversations like that. So there's the big picture in half the time. You missed the conversation. I probably didn't represent it well, but that's the data on Alpha. Next week, we're going to talk about children from infancy to preteen and just kind of scratch the surface on some important things. Hopefully I'll have the class video. If not, I'll do another one of these.